Good morning. It's January 2017, and I have been busy knitting hats. I'll call them feline-eared cats for lack of controversy or controversy, however you'd like to say it. I'm on now starting hat number 18 and 19, and I thought I would share some of the things that I've been thinking about as I've been knitting hat after hat after hat about knitting in the round. To begin with, casting on, I like to do a long tail cast on. Now some people like to take a single skein and do the inside and outside of the skein or the cake and take two threads out, knot them together into a slip knot and start casting on, because this way you don't have to worry about how much yarn you pulled out. You just keep pulling from the ball and away you go without considering how much yarn you need. What I don't like about that is you start out with this double loop and you end up with extra tails. And I find with knitting in the round, there's enough hanging out already, enough confusion to not have extra yarn hanging there. So I actually prefer for a hat to try to guesstimate how much I'm going to need. I do use that other method quite often, but not for knitting in the round. I just find it a little bit too much to deal with. So what I do is I just basically think, how much would about 30 stitches be? So, I'm sorry, it doesn't quite fit in, but it's maybe about, I'm doing about 3 feet. And then I just take the yarn and kind of reproduce that 3 times. I'm aiming for about 92 stitches in the round. So I have this much yarn pulled out. And then what I do is I take the end that is loose and I put it in front of the needle, and then I just do a little twist, and that brings that loose end to the back. And basically what's happening now is most of the yarn I'm going to be pulling out is going to be pulled out from the ball rather than what I pulled out in reserve. The long tail cast on is one that I really like to use for knitting in the round because it's stretchy and it doesn't twist as much as some of the other cast ons do. So I find it the one I go to all the time. There are other options, of course, but this is the one I like to use. You can see this in lots of videos, but basically we have this little twist here and I just drop my needle down. I have a little slingshot and get that thread that's under my thumb, twist that slingshot around and grab the thread that is coming out from my index finger and bring it through that loop and pull it in. And once I've done that, that little twisty bit I did here is now a stitch and it's perfectly secure. It's just fine. Once again, down, around, and through. And don't tighten because it'll be really hard to come around afterwards and get your needle through there to make your first round. So just up, back, and through, and gently tighten. So that's basically the long tail cast on. I have one that has been cast on with my 92 stitches, but what I did is actually I did 93 stitches, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. The first thing that I'm going to do once my stitches are all cast on is to make sure that all my cast on stitches are aligned and not twisted. A twist works just fine in a Mobius or we can get away with it with a cowl, but not so much with a hat. So what we want to do is align all of the cast on stitches so you have that little cast on edge facing each other in the center. So it's all facing the same direction. So I just get that all nice and aligned. And once I've done that, I have on my right hand side, I have the end that I have just finished casting off, and I have my left hand on the side that I started with that little twisted stitch. And to join it, what I like to do is to take that first stitch, move it over to the right hand needle, so we have this kind of attached here, and then this will be sloppy at first, but I take that last cast on stitch here and move it to the other side. And it looks, really wonky and sloppy and all that. But I have these little threads here that I can pull and tighten that down again. And making sure that I use the yarn that is attached to the ball, not the one that I've just finished casting on, which, yes, I have done that before, and I think other people have too. But make sure I'm getting the yarn from the ball. I will make my first stitch, and this is going to be a 2x2 ribs, so I'm going to do a knit, and I can tighten that down again if I need to by grabbing the loose thread, and then another knit, and then I will do 2 purls. 1, 2. And it's always a little hard when you first start, because even if you're mindful of not tightening up your stitches too much, oftentimes it is a little tighter than when you're just regular knitting. So once again, we're going to do knit, knit, purl, purl. Now, I've had a knitting teacher who said that you should never ever count. You should read your knitting. But I do count. What I do when I'm doing this 2x2 is I do 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And what that's telling me is I've got 4 stitches in the pattern, and the first 2 stitches are knit and the second 2 stitches are purl. I guess yes, I can read my knitting, but I guess instead of trying to stop and read, which you can see these are knit stitches because they don't have the little collar around them. These are purl stitches because they do. It's a little bit like listening to an audiobook rather than stopping to read. You can kind of continue on without thinking too much. I also find, like, if somebody were to walk in right now and I had just said 1, 2, and started talking to me, I would remember 2 and then know to go to 3, 4. Now, that doesn't mean I don't kind of lose track of myself now and then. I can read my knitting, but I just find this really a fast way to get around and get that first row done. Now, once you've done it properly, you can, again, read your knitting pretty easily, and you'll see pretty quickly if you're off. If you start to knit this purl stitch, you'll start to get a moss stitch rather than a rib. So it's a little easier. But the first one, I find I just do that counting just because it's so easy to lose track. You don't have any placeholders for you. When you do the second round, you do. You have what's come before. All right, so once you get to the end, which I am near to the end here, remember we had that little crossed over stitch, and I mentioned that I put on an extra stitch. So what we want to do is get everything aligned here, of course. And so this is my working yarn there. Let's get back where I belong. And so basically what I want to do here is I have my last 4 stitches coming up, and we have just done 1, 2, 3, 4. We've just done our knit, knit, purl, purl. So I need to do knit, knit, 1, 2, purl. But this time I've got an extra stitch, and I can kind of see it has a little collar on it because I've done that little crossover there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this stitch and that little extra stitch and purl those 2 together. You could do this at the beginning of the cast on if you wanted to. I usually do it at the end just to make sure I've got everything situated. But you can put a marker there. Now, going back to reading your knitting to make sure you're right where you want to be, is we know we're going to start the round with a knit, knit, purl, purl. So we have ended with a knit, 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 purl, purl. I'm using 2 threads held together because I am frankly running out of pink yarn like crazy, so I'm using whatever I can find. So this is 2 strands of fingering to make it more like a sport weight or DK weight probably. So now once I get around again, I just go knit, knit, purl, purl. And, you know, I can continue doing that 1, 2, 3, 4 if I wanted to. But you can see now you have a little roadmap because you can see what has come before. You have the knit stitches, the purl stitches with the little collar on it that you can see. And you can tell pretty quickly if you get off. But once you start doing this, you can see the rib starting to form. It's usually about the third or fourth row that you really see it, but you can already see it now. And certainly when you come around the third time, you're really going to see if you get off because these look really different in these columns. The other thing I would want to mention about the feline eared hat is that basically it is a pattern that is squared off, and if you put a round head into the squared off pattern, you get these little ears sticking up. I mean, basically, you just get these ears, your head's in there. And what I've done with these in addition is I either tack it down or put a little bow in the corner. And the other thing that's really interesting about this pattern is that you can really start going off in your own direction. I actually use this pattern is a completely different pattern. It's one that has ear flaps. And all that I did with this is, I think this is the Norwegian ear flap pattern that's for free on Ravelry. All that I did is instead of following the instructions to reduce down at the top, I just kept knitting up straight. So you could pretty much take any pattern and just knit it up straight. And then I finish it off with a Kitchener stitch. And I will do the Kitchener stitch on the hats that I just cast on a little bit later, and I will show you some of the things that I've been thinking about with Kitchener stitches. I've done it 17 times now. But one thing I have to say about this project that I absolutely love is that I have done Kitchener stitch now so many times that I will never have to look it up again. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful for people who have not knitting around very much, or even if you have, just some thoughts on some ways of doing it. And Happy New Year!